John Costini here with a discussion about Lords of the Fallen to talk about an endgame build for a Paladin type character, though it is going to be a dual wielding type Paladin. But as far as I'm concerned, the Paladin is just a character wearing heavy armor or heavier armor that also uses holy spells in support. The weapons, far less relevant from my perspective. Now, this particular build is built around one weapon that you can acquire relatively early on in the game. How early on? Well, let's just say that by the time you defeat the first Colossus boss, the first Beacon Guardian, because there are all of these beacons, those beams of light, those red beams of light shooting up in the sky, those are beacons. By the time you defeat the first Beacon Guardian in the Fen, you should be able to get the materials and stats needed to be able to use this weapon. And this is, of course, Pieta's sword. Now, I've done a whole video on the subject, how to get it, why it's useful. Suffice to say, it is an incredibly powerful weapon, though I'm going to link the video at the end of this one. Now, this weapon is gained from the Remembrance of Pieta, which you will get since Pieta marks the end of the tutorial section of the game. It requires 25 Radiance, and it requires 40 Umbral Scourings. It's not the Radiance that's going to be the biggest issue. It's going to be the Umbral Scouring. So I would avoid looking out for all of those memories that do give Umbral Scourings. And as I said, by the time you get to the first Beacon boss, you should be able to either get the weapon outright or come very, very close to being able to use it. Now, it is an expensive weapon to buy in terms of Umbral Scourings. It's an expensive weapon to use because you're going to need that 25 Radiance. It's also an expensive weapon to upgrade, but it is an incredibly powerful weapon. Now, here's the thing about Pieta's sword. What makes it so powerful? It does pure holy damage, which in itself is a benefit compared to pure physical. Even against enemies that might be resistant to radiance damage, as it's called in the game, it's still a really powerful weapon. But here's the thing about Pieta's sword. It's a short sword, so it's very light, so you don't have weight issues wearing this. It scales off radiance, so all that radiance you need to be able to use it in the first place, it's going to be very useful because it's going to buff the weapon you're going to use. So for instance, over here, I have only 31 radiance, and this weapon is doing quite well. Now, this is fully upgraded, and it also has a bunch of gems that, or runes that increase the radiance scaling, because it is using 2 radiance runes in it. But it is an incredibly potent weapon. And I've also put a rune that increases physical damage while dual wielding, though honestly that might not necessarily be the best choice over here. Because you're not necessarily going to do a huge amount of physical damage. At least, obviously, not with the main hand weapon, though your offhand is going to be a different discussion altogether. It might be beneficial to get an offhand that does physical damage. Like, if I could increase radiance damage, holy damage, while dual wielding, that would obviously be the best with Pieta's sword. But because it's a short sword, it hits really fast. And here's the thing, this weapon has the kind of reach that a grand sword, as they're called, or great sword, as it's called in this game. It's called grand sword, but yeah, I prefer great sword. It has the kind of reach that you might see in, say, a great sword. Certainly the kind of reach that you would see in a long sword, but it attacks much faster. So this is it with the dual wield. The way I'd call Pieta's sword, it's the bastard sword of Lords of the Fallen. So the bastard sword from Dark Souls 1, which kind of plays out similarly in terms of how it attacks all that. And it's also a weapon you can acquire relatively early on in Dark Souls. So really good weapon, this one. So if you're going with a two-hand grip, you are going to have a great deal of reach, and you're going to be able to strike very fast for a relatively low cost in terms of stamina. That is the main benefit. But really, in terms of the two-hand grip, but in really the most potent version of this weapon is if you're dual wielding with it, or even if you're using it one-handed, because even using it one-handed, it's still an incredible sword. Like, you see how fast I'm hitting with this thing is an incredible level of speed that you can achieve with it while using it one hand. So you might even want to consider using this with a shield, or just not using a shield. Personally, I don't like using shields. I find that I rarely, if ever, block. So if I'm going with a one-handed weapon, I'm not using a shield at all, really. So it is a fairly fast weapon. When it's used on its own, it's incredibly fast. It does a significant amount of damage. Because it's not just the raw damage that it's doing that makes it so incredibly potent. It's also the fact that it has a hidden effect that's not mentioned in the tooltip, even the expanded tooltip, that if I were to gain more radiance. Rather, the way this weapon works, the main benefit really, is not the holy damage, the radiant scaling, or anything like that, or its length. It's the fact that it has a secondary effect. When you hit an enemy, you have a chance to do a smite, basically a lightning attack on an enemy. So that is about 100 or so extra damage that you can do with Pieta sword every single swing. So hitting an enemy very fast with this, either in dual wield fashion or a one-hand fashion, is quite incredible. Like, it seems that the weapon does handle much better if you're just using it in one hand. Like, it will hit faster and will certainly do a significant amount of damage. So when you originally pick it up, you might just want to use this on its own, no shield, nothing like that, in a one-hand grip. Shields, the way the shields work, they block some of the damage, or they do some of the damage, but you're still going to take withering damage. So you could use a shield if you so desire. Like, let me just equip a shield, because I obviously do have some. So if I equip a shield, it's still a fairly fast weapon. So hey, you want to play a proper Paladin with a shield? Yeah, go ahead with that. Personally, I do prefer dual wielding, because while obviously you're slower dual wielding, you will do extra damage with your offhand. Now, the problem you're going to encounter here, because you only need, like, if you were to use Pieta sword, you would only need, really, radiance, vitality, and endurance, right? Endurance to increase your stamina, vitality to increase your HP, radiance to increase Pieta sword damage. Now, the problem is that there's no offhand that works quite the same way that Pieta sword. Well, there is, but the options that you would have for an offhand that could work that would work quite well in terms of like the stance it's using. All of those are late game options, and like very, very late game. Like by a point you've already beaten the game more or less. So I'm not really going to talk about those too much, though. One of the options you have available late game is the melted Dark Crusader sword. This thing is acquired from like the very last area of the game. It's a short sword. It will allow you to hit very fast. Crucially, it scales like crazy with all of the stats you have. And this is just +4. I'm not going to upgrade it further because unless I'm playing New Game Plus, in which case, yes, I would look to upgrade it quite far. It is hard to get the chunks, chunks in order to upgrade it to 10. You can get, like, you start with small chunks, then you get medium ones, then you get large ones, and all of those will eventually be acquired from vendors in infinite quantity. But chunks, which are required to upgrade things to level 10 or 5 with something like Pieta sword, because it is a special weapon. For a regular weapon, it's +10. For a special weapon, it's +5. But chunks, there's only a handful of those in the game. Maybe there's a vendor somewhere. Maybe there's some that I've missed. But yeah, getting access to chunks is an issue. So which weapon would I recommend you use as an offhand? Well, I'd basically narrow it down to two main options. One, that you will always acquire because it is from a mandatory boss you need to defeat, the Hunter boss specifically, the Sin Piercer boss who has all the hounds in that arena close enough to where you find the blacksmith. By the way, tip for that boss, just run around, avoid the dogs, don't even fight them, focus on the boss, dodge her attacks, dodge her melee attacks, dodge her range attacks, just keep running around, don't engage in the dogs, because if you have to kill the dogs, you're wasting time really. That's how I defeated her. Wasn't really that difficult. By the way, she will give you the Sin Piercer sword, most likely. And the Sin Piercer sword, while it doesn't have radiant scaling, it's still a short sword. It does a decent amount of damage. It doesn't have high requirements. It is a pretty solid weapon. Now, the problem is not even in the fact that it scales with strength and agility, which is not obviously great considering that you're going to dump a lot of points in radiance. The problem is that the runes, like you have radiant runes, which you have 2 radiant runes, which isn't great for a weapon that isn't using radiance. So that's not a great choice. Problem is there's not really a whole lot of other options, with the exception of one, and that is the Hammer of the Holy Agony. So Hammer of Holy Agony can be acquired relatively on in a game. You do need the Pilgrim's Perch Key, and what you do is, like, once you get to the Bell Room, where you meet the Gravedigger, if you will, he will... there is a door to the right as you enter the Vestige area, and if you go there and you run past the enemies, don't fight them because they're higher level enemies than you're supposed to deal with at that point. But if you run past the enemies, you can actually acquire the Hammer of Holy Agony pretty early on. It doesn't have high requirements. It scales with strength and radiance, and it does both physical and holy damage. There's no weapon that I could find that does just pure holy damage. The only alternative that's as good as Pieta Sword is literally an end boss weapon that you acquire from the Umbral ending. That's the only alternative, and it's basically a corrupted version of Pieta Sword. I'm not going into further details on that, but suffice to say, the only alternative really to Pieta Sword that's as good as Pieta Sword would be something like that. Don't use a longsword, don't use something like that. Now, of course, with the Hammer of Holy Agony, there are some other options that you can use, but Hammer of Holy Agony is obviously a really, really solid weapon. It does a decent amount of damage. It does have pretty good scaling. And you can either use Sid Piercer, as I have, to have two swords with the same kind of, well, reach, relatively speaking. Though obviously Pieta Sword has a longer reach. It's just a longer weapon. Though don't be fooled by the graphical effect, because it's not quite that long, but still, it's certainly longer than many other weapons that you will get in the game. Now, the way I would use these weapons, like if I'm trying to reach an opponent from range and not get hit, then using a two-hand grip is the way to go. If I'm in close melee, I'm dodging around the enemies, then what I want to do is switch to a two-hand with a dual-wield grip and just do a significant amount of DPS very, very quickly. Between the smite effects and the speed that you have with these weapons, you'll be able to do a significant amount of damage. Then there's a catalyst. You get Wilmark's catalyst relatively early on in the Fen as well. It's from the statue you encounter there, so you free the statue. There's plenty of other catalysts available. It's not necessarily this one, but this one has 4 spell slots and a decent amount of scaling. It also requires 18 radiance to use. Now, this will give you 4 spell slots. It doesn't have the highest level of spell power that you can get, but it's certainly a great choice. You don't need to upgrade it too much. Like here, I've only upgraded +7. Not even going to go necessarily much further unless I decide to play New Game Plus. But it does have those 4 spell slots. Now, spell-wise, let's talk about this. So here are the things that I would recommend using. Radiant Weapon can be acquired from the merchant that sells, radiant spells relatively early on. So that's not a problem. That's not something really that I need to explain. Then you get Blessed Reflections. This is also for Umbral Scourings that you get from Pieta's memory. So what this does is it summons 2 duplicates to attack your enemy. So if I just do that, you get these 2 guys. You can do like 1,000 damage with these guys, or 900, I think it's by default. But obviously it scales based on your catalyst, based on your spell power. Radiant Weapon will put a holy damage buff on both your weapons. Yes, it does affect Pieta Sword as well. So it's going to increase the damage you're doing with weapons. It's about 100, though I think there is some scaling involved in that. Then you get Sanctify. Sanctify is great for 2 reasons. One, it's a pretty solid healer. Yes, it is only a healing area, so that obviously that has its limitations. But it is a great way to keep yourself alive and to also keep NPCs alive. Like when you're dealing with a difficult boss, you can put this down, help heal them. And more importantly, it cleanses status effects from anyone who walks in it. So if you're walking this, let's say you've got poison or bleeding or anything, or fire, and you walk in this, it will remove that effect. And then finally, a late game weapon buff is Lacerating Weapon. Now, the Lacerating Weapon is acquired in this area in the Abbey. So this is a very late game option that you can get, but it basically imbues the weapon with blood. So you're doing bleed damage. There are some enemies, quite a few enemies, that are resistant to holy damage to a degree or another. So hey, you know how blood was really powerful in Elden Ring? Yeah, well, dual-wielding blood weapons, that will work. And these buffs that you can cast do last for a fair amount of time. People have said like 90 seconds. So either way, the duration is certainly long enough to use. So that's the weapon situation. Pieta sword with either St. Piercer or the hammer of Holy Agony that I mentioned, both of which can be acquired fairly early on, and then Blessed Reflections, Radiant weapons, Sanctify, and Lacerating weapons in terms of your weapon loadout. And now, you don't need a lot of strength or agility, as I mentioned, to use this. In fact, you might not need much at all, really, past the starting stats. I'd recommend starting with the base class with this and building up. Like, here's how I'd start. When I'm starting playthrough, what I would do is I would start with the default class the game has, like the very one at the top. And I would get 13 Inferno before facing Pieta. You can certainly farm it in the early area and get 2 raw Mangler axes. Then I would unlock the blacksmith as quickly as possible, upgrade these axes to +2. I would stop at +2 because you want to save the materials, the medium nuggets, the large ones especially. You want to save those for Pieta's weapon to upgrade them. Get Pieta's weapon. Like with these raw Mangler axes, you can deal with anything you encounter by the time you get enough Umbral Scourings to unlock Pieta's weapon, Pieta's sword. And then, yeah, switch to Pieta's sword. Armor-wise, early armor, I would use I would just, use the default armor you start with, then get the Angel of the Void armor set, and then move on to some heavier armor, though keep in mind you will need a decent amount of equipment load in order to use heavier armor. So let's talk about that. One of the best armors you can acquire relatively early on in the game, like you finish the Fen, you're moving on towards Lower Calrath, you go through Fitzroy's Gorge, and you will encounter a ruiner on the bridge. Past that ruiner lies the entrance of Lower Calrath, but before you enter Lower Calrath, there is this tower over here with this great bonfire. It's kind of hard to miss. It's where the light. It's close enough to one of the areas where the Light Reaper is going to show up to try and kill you. You climb up this tower, and in this chest over here, you will find Fitzroy's armor. And you will also find a memory that's going to showcase, like, Fitzroy's last moments, because this is where he died. Now, the armor itself is a heavy set of armor. It offers a good amount of protection, really high level of protection. This is an armor you can use basically throughout the rest of the game if you so desire, because it is that solid of an armor set. Now, it is certainly a heavy set of armor, so you're going to need a lot of equipment load, endurance, vitality, just increase that. How much do you need? That's a good question. Well, with Pieta's sword and with the St. Peter's sword and Merrick's catalyst, combined with the entirety of Fitzroy's set, you need 89 equipment load in order to use them. Basically, the way equipment load is, like, if you're over, like in this case, over 127 in my case, which I can certainly do very, very easily if I just, equip some heavy weapons over here. Let's see. Or maybe, very heavy weapons, apparently. Yep. So if you're above that 127, you have heavy encumbrance. You never want to get to heavy encumbrance because the rolls you're going to have are going to be pretty terrible to deal with. So that's what you want to do in terms of armor. Relatively early on. Like before this, yes, as I stated, the Angel of the Void, this can be acquired in the village just before the first beacon protector. This is certainly a decent set of armor. You can use, obviously things like Hollow Knight, some other pieces that you pick up along the way. But it's Fitzroy's armor that is one piece of armor you can acquire in what I'd consider the early mid-game that is going to be really good. You will need a good amount of endurance and vitality in order to use it, but it's certainly worth using. Like, if you are struggling, like, you can use the Defaced Ring, which you can acquire relatively early on to help you a bit with that. You can also use Ring of Duty combined with that to help you in terms of the equipment load. Make that work, improve your chance, improve your equipment load. Now, later on in the game, what do you want to use? Now, as I stated, Fitzroy's set is the set that you can use for the rest of the game if you so desire, but there are obviously upgrades that you can pick up. Well, you do have the Sovereign Protector set, so I'm just going to equip this. Now this is even heavier as a set of armor. I really don't like the helmet personally, so I would still probably use Fitzroy's helmet. Hell, hey, I'm a big Fashion Souls guy. But this set can be acquired from the mine area, so this is later on. So after you deal with lower Calraf, you'll be getting into the mines. You'll get this set over there. It's kind of hard to miss, really. Like, just, you know, keep exploring, keep picking things up. And this just offers a higher level of protection at a decent weight difference. So if we look at Fitzroy's set, like 36.8 in terms of the torso, 39 for the Sovereign Protector, but it is higher protection level than what Fitzroy is offering. So you have an obvious upgrade in terms of protection. There are armors that do offer better elemental protection, like Holy Fire and Withering, but in terms of pure physical damage, and physical is going to be the vast majority of the damage you're going to take in any particular situation, the Sovereign Protector is a really good set that you can use for the rest of the game. Hey, if you want a decent enough helmet that looks better, you can also get the Calraf Guardsman Helm. I believe this is acquired in upper Calraf, you know, just for Fashion Souls, if you will. So yeah, like looking like a bit like a Roman Centurion over here. Not necessarily too fond of how so many plate armors have a cloak, because it kind of ruins the effect, but absolutely worth using over there. And for the very late game, you can switch up to the cursed, well, not even a cursed armor set, like, though the cursed armor set does give you better withering protection. You do get Tancred set. So Tancred set is even heavier than that. Kind of looks off with, you know, the hands over there, but at least it doesn't have a cloak that ruins it from behind, right? So those are some options that you do have when it comes to this, but yeah, Sovereign Protector or even Fitzroy you can use for the rest of the game. What I've personally switched to, because yeah, I'm a Fashion Souls guy, is Stoneman's Armor. So Stoneman's Armor is acquired through doing Stoneman's Quest. You will eventually get the armor, but this is basically an endgame armor. So it's certainly on the lighter side that offers less protection than Fitzroy's set, but hey, looks cool. That's ultimately all that really matters from my personal perspective. But yeah, obviously the level of protection is significantly lower than the Sovereign Protector armor. And then finally, to cap it off, let's talk about Pendant and rings. So Pendant-wise, the one you may want to go for is the Imperium Pendant. Now, this is acquired from the vendor that sells, you know, Radiant Weapon, all that. This is acquired from the vendor in the hub area, but you do need to give him certain items. I'm not entirely sure which item it is. Basically, as you're progressing through the game, you'll find a bunch of rosaries. One of these rosaries at one point will unlock the Imperium Pendant is 4.5k vigor. How much does this add? So this increases holy damage and holy defense. Keep in mind, some of the in-game enemies will be doing holy damage, so you having holy defense can be pretty useful to actually have. But how much damage increases this? Keep in mind, Pieta sword is obviously doing a lot of physical damage, a lot of holy damage. Sorry, about 10% from what I've noticed. So you're looking at 10% damage buff with everything holy. That's decent enough, but obviously it's something that will take some time to acquire. Other options. Well, you can use the Paladin's Pendant. Keep in mind, if you're not picking a Paladin as a starting class, it's gonna take a long time to actually get access to this. But certainly, we're looking at this. So looking at the endurance, it is a decent level of endurance. It is a decent level of strength. So honestly, starting with this pendant alone is a significant benefit, just because of how hard it can be to acquire much later on. Like in this case, I didn't start with the Paladin because I foolishly went with the shield. At a knight. Big mistake, because missing out on the Paladin Pendant, it's a really good early game pendant if you want to go for it. Like, yeah, you can increase your maximum HP if you want to, though it doesn't really feel that worth it, honestly. So, like, you see the empty bar there, that's how much it's increased my HP by. Don't think that's worth it. One of the much better ones that you can get early on is the Warrior's Claw. Or you can also get the Pendant of Enduration. But the Warrior's Claw is probably a really good choice. Now, how do you acquire the Warrior's Claw? The Warrior's Claw is behind a locked room, right next to where you acquire the blacksmith. Now, there's a lot of enemies there, difficult enemies, so don't go fighting them. But if you run past them, it's lying on the floor. If you run past them, you can pick it up. You will die in the process, make no mistake on that, because there's a lot of crossbowmen, there's a bunch of knights and all that. So it's going to be difficult to survive that, but it will give you the Warrior's Claw, which what this does is increase the physical damage by about 10% and physical defense by 10%. It's really the physical defense that's more important here, considering the weapon I'm talking about in this particular build. But certainly increasing physical damage because of your offhand, which, regardless of which one you're using, there's no offhand that you're going to have that's going to do pure healing damage, so you're going to get some kind of damage buff with this regardless, but it's really the physical defense. Or yeah, just go Pendant of Enduration for pure physical resistance. There's some other options, but those are the ones I would personally recommend. You can also go with the Hallowed Triptych. This increases holy damage, deals additional posture damage, so if you're using this and a two-hand grip, you can potentially stagger enemies and crucially bosses, so don't ignore that aspect. There can be some benefits with that. But yeah, Warrior's Claw is your general purpose one. The other ones are more, specific to what you're doing, or yeah, just go Empyrean and get that holy damage and holy defense. Rings. Well, one of the best rings to acquire is the Mine Owner ring. This is acquired in like the tutorial area. It's hanging from a tree, so just throw at it with rocks, bring it down, get it, increase max and stamina, and crucially maximum and crucially stamina regeneration rate. That is a fairly solid benefit. Other rings that I would recommend, the Deface ring, which is also acquired very early on, and it basically gives you free vitality. So this is a really solid ring that you can use. Other rings are more, specific to what you're doing. Like, do you want some kind of resistance do you want some kind of resistance? There are plenty of rings for that. Or do you want to inflict like burn buildup or something along those lines, or gain health upon inflicting smite? Because remember, Pieta's sword is inflicting smite. It's that spell, so you might heal yourself a bit there. But other rings, situational. One of the rings that can help you early on until you get a significant amount of vitality and endurance to increase your equipment load is the Ring of Bones. This is also from the mines, so you've got the Sovereign Armor set and you've got the Ring of Bones that are both from the mines. The equipment load can be pretty significant. So if I remove this over here, it drops by 16. So it's giving you 16 equipment load. That can make a significant difference. Like if you drop to a light encumbrance, this is one of the potential benefits of Stoneman's armor, but if you could drop to a light encumbrance, you would be moving much faster on the battlefield. But of course, it's difficult getting a set of armor that will have enough, will be light enough. You probably would have to miss and match some pieces in order to make that work, like maybe sacrifice the chest piece if you want to, though you would obviously sacrifice a significant amount of damage protection if you were to do so, but getting to light encumbrance would be significant in terms of battlefield mobility. Personally, at this point, I probably would go with the Orion Sorcerer Ring. Though the thing is, this is just 10% damage by looks of it, and it's 10% damage on Pieta's sword. I don't think it even affects the spells that much by 10%. Or certainly, it's not affecting. The Blessed Reflections by 10%. At least it doesn't feel like it's affecting the reflections by 10%. You can also go Upper Calrath, which is after mines. Get Queen Verena's the second ring, which gives you passive health regeneration that can be useful. And of course a bunch of other rings. But you can't go wrong with, say, the Deface ring or some other rings available as well. But yeah, Deface ring is not really a bad choice. There's a lot of power that you can get with the right items from very early on. Of course, getting all of these items, upgrading them, using all of them, that's a different discussion. Like, originally when you get Fitzroy's armor, I would recommend probably just using the chest piece above everything else. because it is a heavy piece of armor, but it is certainly going to give you a decent level of protection, and then using other pieces until you get enough equipment load to use the full set. And then, yeah, Sovereign Protector, and then other armor pierces. That's all that I had to say. Questini here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.